Hi everyone. Welcome to today's session on thesis writing and secondary sources. As always, I am your host, Janie Adams, Curator of Education, Staff Historian, National History Day in Arizona Coordinator, and I'm also joined today by Allison Avery, who is also all of those things. So we're really happy to have you here today. So let's hit the ground running with thesis statements. So today's lesson is really looking at thesis statement and secondary sources. And I very intentionally put these two together because in order to truly understand one, you have to understand the other. And we can only become better writers as we practice more and as we read more. It's very important that if we want to become really good writers, that we're also really good readers. So what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is the guiding point of your project. Everything in your project should connect back to your thesis statement. Your thesis is an argument. It is not a description or a summary. Description or summary can be part of your thesis statement, but not the entirety of the statement. So a thesis contains two major parts: the argumentative statement, and then a brief description of how you will prove your point. When we write history papers, we need to remember that these are persuasive essays. We are ultimately trying to prove a point. We're ultimately trying to make a point. And so we need to create a really clear roadmap for how we're actually going to accomplish that. So the point of history writing is to come up with a unique interpretation of the past and create a convincing argument for that interpretation. You are not to simply just report on the past or describe the past or summarize the past, but you need to come to it with a fresh perspective and a fresh interpretation of the past. Okay, that seems scary, but it's not, I promise. So what do I mean by unique? What do I mean by fresh perspective? Your argument for your NHDAZ project or for any historical thinking that you do should be unique from, but inspired by the research that you do. So your argument might not be earth-shattering and heretofore unheard of, but it needs to be solely your own, and that's what makes it unique. So all of that said, history is a conversation between thinkers who approach a topic from different perspectives. So it's important that you really know what's been said about your topic before you go and write that material. And that's where your secondary research comes in, right? So there's this big historical concept called historiography. And historiography is the history of history writing. And if you go back to the first workshop for the fall series, I talk a little bit about the history of history writing, and I talk a little bit about how history thinking has changed over time. Your secondary research should be able to follow kind of the trends of thought in the field that your work belongs to. So if you're doing military history, environmental history, urban history, all of those different things, you should be able to trace a thread through your secondary research where you can see how different ideas, different events impact the way that historians have written about the past. Perspective is key to history writing, right? Like the reason that we do this is so we can become more empathetic human beings, so we can better understand the people around us and the world around us and see where they're coming from. So understandably, bias gets a bad rap, right? We talk a lot about biased sources and looking for the bias in a source. And I really hate to burst everyone's bubble, but every single source has a bias. Every single one. Some of them are really bad. And by really bad, I mean that they intentionally warp evidence to suit their point. But everyone has a bias. Everyone has a different belief set. Everyone's got different identity markers that change the way that they think about the past. So bias is not bad. Your thesis statement will be from your point of view, so it will have a bias. Bias is not inherently bad, but what is bad is when you don't recognize your bias or when you allow your bias to intentionally warp your evidence. So while intentionally warping your evidence and not recognizing your bias are not good, and you should strive not to do them, bias is actually a necessary part of history writing. Some historians will actually add information into their introduction to help the reader understand where they're coming from and why they think the way that they do. So I'll give an example. When I was an undergraduate in college, I wrote this paper, and I was really interested in looking at American female beauty standards during the Second World War and how total mobilization, total war during the Second War impacted American female beauty standards. But when I was researching, I realized that what I was actually talking about was single, white, upper middle class women who for the first time in their lives had disposable income. And that's a very small portion of the population, right? We're not talking about married women. We're not talking about women of color. We are not talking about women who exist out of kind of a heteronormative system. We're talking very much about the kinds of girls that you would see in a lipstick advertisement. And so I wrote that in my introduction, and I said, look, my research has this bias. All of this additional work has to be done. I recognize that my work is biased. I'm going to recognize that it's biased. I'm not going to beat myself up about it, and I'm going to move on and prove my point. So it's really important to remember that because something is coming from your point of view, it will have some bias, and that's okay. It's when you allow your bias to change the way that you understand materials and intentionally change the way that materials are understood is when bias is bad. Okay, so a little bit of clarification about argument versus declaration / description / summary. So a declarative statement, right? A statement of fact, a description, summary, those are not argument. So we have these two sentences that I've taken from the University of Iowa History Writing Guides. The first one says, this paper argues that the movie JFK is inaccurate in its portrayal of President Kennedy. The second sentence says, in this paper, I will describe the portrayal of President Kennedy as shown in the movie JFK. So which one is the argument and which one is the declaration, description, summary? These ones are pretty straightforward because they've used that verb, and so that's really helpful. But we know that this one right here, the one with the circle around it, is the argument, right? It has an argumentative point. However, it is not a thesis. Why is it not a thesis? Remember, we said a thesis has two major parts. The first one is the argument, the statement of argument. The second part is the reason why you believe that to be true, right? So in order to turn this sentence into a thesis statement, this author could say something like, this paper argues that the movie JFK is inaccurate in its portrayal of President Kennedy because whatever their evidence is from the film and also their own research on President Kennedy. So remember that a thesis statement has two major parts: the statement of argument and the reasons you believe that to be true. Okay, so now that we've talked about the two major parts, we're actually going to talk about a secret formula. Every thesis statement in the whole wide world can be broken down into four fundamental parts. And those four fundamental parts are thing is thing, because XYZ. And these parts can be different, right? You might not have three major pieces of evidence. You might have more than three major pieces of evidence. You can really kind of play with this form once you get a sense of how it works. So the things are typically nouns, ideas, concepts. Is a placeholder for a verb. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be is. A really great hack, actually, is to take whatever the most important verb is from the National History Day annual theme and slot that into the sentence. And I'll show you an example on the next slide. Because lets the reader know that you have evidence to back up your claim, right? Thing is a full sentence. Subject, verb, object, full sentence. Because clues the reader in to letting know that there's more to the story. And then X, Y, and Z are the reasons that you know the relationship between the two things, the two ideas, the two concepts, the two nouns are true, or X, Y, Z become a roadmap showing how you will prove your point. I know that seems really complicated, but I'll give you a really good example on the next page. Okay. Thing is thing because X, Y, Z. We're going to take our theme. I took the theme from last year, which was communication and history, the key to understanding. And then I thought about my own research interests. And if you attended any of the workshops last year, you know, all of my examples were about Chicano music and Lalo Guerrero and the history of Chicano music in the Chicano movement. And so I have my research questions. And my research questions are, how did Chicano music communicate the needs of Chicano people and help create a Chicano identity? So I have all of those parts. Now I'm ready to write a working thesis. So this is what I came up with. Chicano music communicated the needs of Chicano people by using catchy, danceable music to share with a national audience the political, economic, and social struggles of La Raza. See how it's got all of the parts from thing is thing because X, Y, Z? My things are Chicano music and the needs of Chicano people. My connecting verb is communicated, which I've pulled directly from the annual theme, right? So I'm already making the argument that not only do I have this larger kind of fabulous point about Chicano music, but I'm also directly tying it to the annual theme, which you absolutely must do. So I've ripped that verb right out of the annual theme. I have a by, which is my connecting word, which lets my reader know that not only am I making this claim, but I have evidence to back it up. And then I have my pieces of evidence that I'm going to talk about during the course of my paper. It really is that easy. And once you kind of figure this formula out, you can absolutely play with it. However, it's really important to learn the rules before you break them. I know that students sometimes are really uninterested in doing pre-writing activities or just want to riff and just want to go for it. And, oh, I've never written a thesis statement and I always get an A on my paper. I really want you to think about what it is that you're trying to do here. Are you trying to get an A on your paper? Or are you trying to say something meaningful about the past, right? I think that those are two really different things sometimes. So when you're learning to write theses, which I always want to say theses every time I see it, but it's theses, you might need this formula like training wheels, right? You might need to hold on to it. You might need to constantly reference it to help you write a good thesis. But once you practice and practice and practice, I promise, you will become a thesis writing wizard. And when you get to college, or, let's say when you become an adult, you become embroiled in this big debate with a coworker, you already know how to structure an argument. You already know how to get your points across, and you won't need the formula anymore. You'll just do it. It'll just be so automatic. The best way to become a better writer is practicing and reading. You have to write and you have to read. If you're not willing to do those things, you're probably never going to improve as a writer, right? So it's really important that you practice, that you see how other historians or other thinkers write on a topic that's similar to yours. How do they pose their argument? It's vital that you learn the rules and then you can experiment with them. But promise me that you'll learn them first. Okay. It's really important when you're writing a thesis statement to strike a good balance between the specific and the general. So it's really important that your thesis is specific. And I've given some examples. These are also from the University of Iowa history writing guides. So the first example is Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong leader as a first lady. Okay. Like, that is a statement of argument. But why? How do you know that to be true, right? You can't just make this claim. You have to back it up. So that's a really kind of general statement. So we need to get more specific when we write our thesis statement. So if we look at the other one, it says Eleanor Roosevelt recreated the role of the First Lady by her active political leadership in the Democratic Party, by lobbying for national legislation, and by fostering women's leadership in the Democratic Party. So not only does this set up your argument, it tells your readers why you believe what you believe and how you're going to prove what you believe, right? So this is a really good, really specific thesis statement. However, on the other side, it is really important that you're not so specific in your thesis statement that it's long or hard to understand or contains evidence. Again, once you learn the rules, you can break them and you can play with them. But I think kind of traditionally, we teach students not to introduce any new evidence or new ideas in your introduction or your conclusion. And that's for a reason, right? In introduction, you're really thinking about your topic. You're really trying to get your reader set up to read the rest of your paper. And you don't want to bring in any new information in the conclusion because that's not concluding. You've just added more information. So the ideal thesis length is 1 to 3 sentences, depending on how long your project is and the scope of your research. Sometimes people will write these like thesis statements that are 3 pages long, but they're writing a whole 300-page book, right? So you have to strike a balance with those. Best practice is to never introduce your actual evidence, your actual research in the introduction of your project. And by that, I mean you probably in your thesis statement don't want to cite a specific example, like a super specific example. So your thesis is the hook. You want to give just enough bait to catch the reader's attention, and then you reel them in with the body of your project. Lots of sports metaphors in history writing. Okay, some final additional thought about theses. Just write one. Just start. Just pick up a pencil, write down your ideas, and just start writing. You need to have something to guide your process in the beginning. I know that it feels really intimidating to do so, but just start writing. Just pick a thesis and go with it. Because, to the second point, you will need to be prepared to revise your thesis. Your thesis is a living creature, and it will change as you learn more about your topic. So you always want to make sure that your thesis still makes sense when you start compiling your research, right? Sometimes we get so excited about the research that we found, we really lose sight of our thesis statement. So it's really important that when you're evaluating the body of research that you've put together, you go, okay, now that I know all this stuff, does my thesis still make sense? Is my thesis still relevant given all the stuff that I know? Remember that history, or at least history in the Western tradition, is largely modeled off of the scientific method. And so in the scientific method, you hypothesize, test, use the results of that test to rehypothesize, retest, so on and so forth. History works the same way. So you just want to make sure that your thesis statement and your evidence go together regardless of where your evidence takes you. You can always tweak your thesis statement. And then the very last point that I think is super critical is that your thesis statement is a roadmap. And your thesis statement is a roadmap, not just for you to keep your ideas together and your research together and your project focused, but also a roadmap for your reader while they're engaging with your project. The thesis statement really lets the reader know what they're in for. And it really lets the reader know, do I want to keep reading this work? Which we'll talk about when we talk about secondary sources. So we're going to take a quick interlude if you're following along at home and you're filling out your roadmap. The secret code word for today's session is Oatman. If you've never been to Oatman, it's fascinating. There are like wild donkeys all over the place, and they're very, very nice. It's an old mining town, probably copper mining. I'm not really sure. Yeah, kind of a fun little funky place off of Route 66. Okay, so what's a secondary source? So a secondary source is a source that reflects or comments on or analyzes the past. Secondary sources look at other secondary sources and analyze primary sources to come to a unique interpretation about the past. And a lot of I'm going to sound like a broken record for a lot of this, but your thesis statement, your secondary sources, all that stuff, they're all unique interpretations of the past. They might be really similar, they might be really inspired by each other, but each representation is unique because each writer is unique. Each perspective is unique. So in today's conversation, we're going to focus primarily on books and academic articles, because those are the ones that students really tend to struggle with. It can be really intimidating. You know, I've got some books behind me here that are 800 pages long. When you get handed an 800-page book, it can be really intimidating. So I'm going to break down some of the mythology around historical monographs and articles, but just keep in mind that there are other kinds of secondary sources like opinion pieces, you know, newspaper articles that are opinion pieces, encyclopedias, commentaries, criticisms, textbooks, interviews, sometimes, things like that, secondary sources. Okay, understanding secondary sources. So there's a reason we discussed theses first before we talked about secondary sources. So when you're approaching a secondary source, particularly a book, always, 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 always read the introduction. I know that it is super tempting to skip the intro and go right into the meat of the work. But the intro has all the stuff that you need. The intro has the thesis statement. The intro has the evidence roadmap. The thesis has the connection to a larger body of, or the intro has a connection to the larger body of historical thinking. If you are going to read any two parts of any historical monograph, any historical book, read the introduction, read the bibliography. Those two things are key. Everything else, you can cheat and use the index to access, but you have to read the intro. And when you're reading the introduction to the book, try to isolate all of those different parts. Try to isolate the thesis statement, isolate the evidence roadmap, isolate the connection to the larger body of historical thinking. That will help you figure out if you actually want to read the whole book, right? Like, you don't want to commit to reading an 800-page book and then realize that, like, oh, I thought this book was on X, but it's actually about Y, and that doesn't help me. Okay, so this giant wall of text I'm going to read to you. This is from the introductory section of an article from the Journal of Arizona History, written by Dr. Flannery Burke. So this is an academic peer-reviewed journal article. The Jibes had begun at Sun City's inception as one of the first communities designed specifically for residents 55 and older. Jack Tucker, a retired Arizona journalist who self-published a book about Sun City in 1985, noted that Sun City scarcely was born back in 1959 and the ribbing began. Some smart aleck sociology experts called it a geriatric ghetto. The two words continued to be the refrain of Sun City's critics. Prejudice against the old and aging underlay criticisms of residents from the community's onset, but so too did Sun City's own aloofness. Arizona residents, such as Benson, resented outsiders arriving and ignoring local conditions, and even more distant observers noted that Sun City presented itself as free of the nation's problems. Such criticisms, however, often came veiled. The word ghetto was frequently the closest that even critics came to evoking the race and class structures that Sun City reproduced. Intriguingly, the residents of Sun City did not call themselves citizens, but rather Sun Cityans. Perhaps it is reading too much into the choice, but Sun Cityans did not appear to want or to be able to accept the obligations of citizens. Between 1960 and 1990, Sun City mirrored Arizona and the nation's vexed relationship to urban civic responsibility and the aged. While historians of post-war Arizona have described Phoenix's embrace of neoliberal capitalist urban system, they have less frequently addressed the intersection of such systems within the cycle of human life. As a retirement destination, Arizona offers an opportunity to see how the state's economic system interacted with a new group to the United States in the post-war period: senior citizens. The elderly not only presented cultural challenges as their number grew during the nation's post-war prosperity, they also posed material ones, often to the very economic engines driving unregulated growth. Individuals aged at Sun City just as they did throughout the United States, but they did so in a suburban development that prized the growth of self-contained household units. The Sun City model capitalized on the fact that no one could turn back the clock while producing housing and urban services that developers called leisure-driven retirement. Politics in Arizona favored those Sun Cityans with resources to buy into the ideas of leisure-driven retirement and quieted the voices of those looking for a place to grow old. The result was a city that was not a city and Cityans who were not citizens. Okay, that is a huge wall of text. And if my reading it to you was confusing, I'm going to stall for a couple of seconds. If you're watching at home, you can pause the video and read it. So that's from the first couple introductory sections of this particular article. And so to help us understand it, I've marked it up. I really want to encourage you to mark up the things that you're reading. If you're reading a library book, you might want to use Post-it notes. Probably don't want to write in a library book. But if you can print an academic article, mark it up with a pen. Use different colors. Do whatever works for you. So in this article, I've used 3 major colors to look at some major points of the article. So the blue is the connections to other thinkers on the topic, right? So the author has cited one of those individuals, cited a second individual, and then talked about historians of post-war Arizona kind of generally. So all of those point to a larger body of work. I've also used green to underline the words that either the concepts that I really didn't understand, the concepts that I might want to look up, the things that would be confusing, right? It's okay to read an article and come across words that are confusing. Make a note, circle them, write them down, whatever, look them up, come back to it. Sometimes we have to use these concepts. Remember we were talking about jargon last week? Sometimes we have to use concepts that can be difficult to understand, but we don't want to verge into jargon, right? So example, neoliberal capitalist urban system, there probably isn't an easier way to say that, right? But if you don't know what neoliberalism is, you probably need to look that up. And then, of course, the red section. So the red section is what I've identified as a potential thesis statement for the article. Typically, if you're looking for another hack, typically the thesis statement is somewhere towards the end of the introductory section, but not always. But you really want to think about like, what is the point that this person is trying to make? What is the major argument that they are trying to make? And so I've selected kind of the last 3 or so sentences of this section that I think are potentially the thesis statement. And remember, now that you know the parts of a thesis statement, you can think about, okay, how do we see the declaration of the argument, the statement of the argument, and then how do we see kind of where the author is going to get their evidence from? How are they going to back this thing up? And you can see that in this section that I've highlighted in red. Okay, so that's a little bit about how to actually read secondary sources. The other reason that secondary sources are incredibly important is because you can mine the bibliography for additional source material. Historians, particularly historians in the United States and in the Western tradition, like Chicago style. And the reason that historians like Chicago style is because it uses footnotes, and the footnotes allow you to stay in the text of the work and not get taken out of the narrative by an in-text citation. Historians just prefer footnotes. But you can do this with any work, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a work in Chicago style to be considered a secondary source. If you read any part of the secondary source, like I said, you want to read the intro and then skim the citations. This will help you find other works that are related either by topic or by methodology, and to find primary sources that you can explore for yourself. Sometimes authors will also include other annotations like ideas for future research, connections to other works or concepts, or other interesting tidbits. So I've also isolated the footnotes from that section that I just read to you. And this is why the footnotes are so important. You get this citation here from Jack Tucker, and you can see, you know, if you were interested in learning more about what Jack Tucker had to say, about Sun City, you could look into that yourself. Here is a citation of another secondary source. 2 excellent examples of economic studies of post-war Arizona, and then you've got additional secondary sources. You've got the author explaining how they arrived to a definition of a word. So footnote 8, my thinking of the elderly as a crop has been influenced by. So this is why the citations are so important. Not only is the historian kind of doing their due diligence and giving credit where credit is due, but the citations also are where the connections, where the kind of thought process for the argument occurs. And then the body of the work is actually the formal presentation of that argument. So you always want to make sure that you read the citations. So if you're going to read any part of a secondary source book or article, read the introduction, read the citations. Super, super important. Okay, questions to ask yourself when analyzing secondary sources. If you're new to analyzing secondary sources, it can be really intimidating, especially if I know a lot of us are really young, and you know, this might be the longest book we've ever read, and that can be really scary and really intimidating. So here are some questions to think about when you're analyzing secondary sources. First, most important question, what do I, as the expert of my own topic, think about this piece? Do I like it? Do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? What elements do I want to examine more closely? What do I want to keep for my own and credit, but keep for my own in my own work? And what do I want to challenge? What do I think this other expert got wrong about the topic? Or what do I think that they're missing, right? So a really good example of that is, let's say you're reading a work and it talks a lot about you know, class differences between people. It talks a lot about middle class people versus working class people, but it doesn't really talk about race and how systemic issues of racism contribute to class conflict. So as the expert on your topic, you might go, oh, I really like Dr. So-and-so's work, but I think I want to engage more meaningfully with race as a concept, for example. What kind of historian is this? Where are they coming from that led them to this interpretation? So a lot of historians fall into one of 2 camps, and this isn't always true, but it might be a helpful tool while you're trying to learn what kind of historian is this. So there are New Left historians. New Left historians tend to be a little bit more critical of the American model. They're a little bit more critical of kind of American concepts and American identities. And by that, I mean, they tend to be more interested in looking at intersectionality. They tend to be more interested in looking at gender and class and race, and really critiquing those elements of American society that don't meaningfully engage with gender and class and race. So New Left historians tend to be a little bit more critical of the American story as a story of progress. Neoconservatives, on the other hand, tend to view American history as purely a story of progress, and that we are just building and getting better and better every time we do something. And yeah, we make mistakes, but we learn from those mistakes. And so those are 2 kind of major camps of historians. There are so many different kinds of historians, but that might help you when you're thinking about what kind of historian this person is. You can always Google them, right? Figure out where they went to school, figure out who their teachers were. That's usually a big kind of marker of the way that someone thinks. That's kind of a high level question, but I think a more important question, or kind of the core of this question, is who is this person? Why might it be that they think the way that they do? Another important question to ask yourself is, who is the publisher? And then what is the intended audience? And does that shape what language is being used, right? So if a book is published by Penguin, for example, Penguin is a mass market publisher, and they publish everything from chapter books to historical monographs. They publish it all. And so that audience is going to be a little bit more of a general audience. But if you pick up an article from a super, super specific academic journal, right? Something like the Western historians of Civil War technology, something like that, that's going to be a really niche group. And the language is going to be really intended for people that are in that group. So it might be a little bit more jargony, for example, because it's not really intended for the larger public to read. What is the purpose of this piece? Are we trying to educate, inform, inspire, persuade? Are we trying to make someone feel bad, right? Like sometimes we're reading an op-ed in a newspaper and the point is to shame someone, for example. So it's really important to think of what is the purpose of this piece. Always got to think about who paid for it. If an article is sponsored, if you ever like see a BuzzFeed article and it's just like 50 best gifts to get your best friend, and it's sponsored by Target, so all of the gifts are from Target, that sways the article, right? It's not truly an objective piece. And you can think about, well, what does that mean? And how does that impact the way that we understand it? So always think about who paid for a piece. And the last question you always want to ask yourself is, well, who's not speaking? Who's missing from this conversation? Whose voices are silenced? And that's always a good way to think about how you can provide unique perspectives into the conversation, right? If during the course of your research, you realize, wow, I'm not seeing a lot of women speaking on this topic, or I'm not seeing a lot of perspective from first or second generation Americans, for example. All of those are really valuable points, and to think about how do you access those points. Okay, a note about trusted sources. I've already said this. I'm going to sound a little silly. I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on. All sources have bias. That is not always a bad thing. Bias is an important part of who we are as human beings. Bias becomes a bad thing when it totally and intentionally misrepresents what the evidence is trying to convey. That is bad. Right? So bias itself is not bad, but when you use bias to try and intentionally misinform people, that is bad. So a note about trusted sources. Typically, we think of like .gov or .edu websites as being good sources, and by and large they are, typically. But it's really important that you are critical of all source material that you come across. Perhaps especially critical of source material that you agree with, or source material that aligns with your political values. Everyone has an agenda. That's not a bad thing. Some organizations, for example, governments or government entities, sometimes they have policies about what they can and cannot say. Sometimes they have these like legacies that are traumatic and would rather not bring them up, right? So people get to shape their own narrative. And so it's always really interesting to think about what isn't being said, right? When an organization writes about themselves, sometimes they're not always super honest. So how would, say, a group that was being oppressed by that organization write about them? And it's important that you look at those two pieces together. So, tinfoil hat, follow the money. Think about who paid for the material, who's getting paid to produce the material. Those are all really big, important questions. Think about who published it. When did they publish it? Why did they publish it? Who is the intended audience? All of those things are so important, right? So a really good example is sometimes when there's like a big national holiday or a really important day of remembrance, organizations will post something like on Instagram or whatever, and they're like, we stand with so-and-so, but their actual politics don't really quite line up, right? So it's really important to think about when, why, how, who published something. Okay, I'm gonna take my tinfoil hat off. I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. I promise. It's really important that as historians, we are really critical of all of the source material that we engage with. And being critical isn't a bad thing. I think that like some words like critical, bias, things like that. I think they've gotten kind of a negative connotation over the years. Same with argument. If you remember our conversation about argument from a couple weeks ago, they've gotten kind of negative connotation over time, but they're not actually bad things. It's just a matter of knowing how to use them. And I hope that's what we're doing here with these workshops, is teaching you how to think critically about things. Okay, so now we are down through 3 workshops, which is so exciting. So we don't have a meeting next weekend. There's no meeting on September 18th, 2021, but there is a meeting on September 25th, 2021, where we're going to be discussing how to navigate the archives in preparation for the October 2nd in-person Ask an Archivist Day. So on the 25th, we're going to be talking about finding resources online. Where do you start with primary source research? How do you find secondary sources if you hit a wall? So you want to make sure that you join us for that one. Otherwise, if you need any help or need any guidance, you can always email us at nhdaz@azhs.gov. And I think that's it, Allison. Do you have anything that you want to say?
Nope, I think you did a great job.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.